I'm Bob Hazel. I'm a historian for the North Carolina chapter of the Wildlife Society. And our purpose today is to interview one of the early pioneers in wildlife management activities in North Carolina. This interviewer is part of the program that we call Celebrating Our Wildlife Conservation Heritage. And in this program, we're interviewing the pioneers in the field of wildlife management, documenting their experiences, and letting them tell their story in their own way, hearing it, as we say, from the people who made it happen. This is December 7, 2001, and our interviewee today is Charles Woodhouse, who I believe is the first trained wildlife biologist to go to work for the newly created Wildlife Resources Commission after World War II, and has a long and productive career in wildlife management, and has made significant contributions to the progress that we've made in the good program that we have. And so we're going to let Charlie tell his story as he sees fit. And Charlie, why don't you just begin? Give us a little about your background and your work with the Wildlife Commission.
Well, I can start at the beginning. I was born in 1917. I was actually born up in Surrey County. I spent most of my life in Bladen County, but during World War I, my folks had moved up to Surrey County to look after my old grandfather till he passed away, and so that's where I was born, actually, up there. And then we moved back to White Oak in Bladen County, and I had my education there in White Oak and in Elizabethtown. We moved to Elizabethtown in the 20s. My dad became county superintendent of schools in Bladen County. So I graduated from Elizabethtown High School, and then I wanted to go to get further education, but at that time, I don't know whether you know anything about politics in schools or not, but it's not surprising. My dad got kicked out right in the 30s during the Great Depression, as we call it. So the only income we had there at that time was from the farm, which wasn't very much. And he certainly didn't have the resources to send me to college. And, fortunately, my oldest brother had managed to get through state college before then, and he'd gotten a position out at state college with the agronomy department. So he told me one day, he said, if you work and earn all the money you can, said, I'll loan you the rest of it to go to school. And so that was a deal. And so I did that. Back then you sure didn't make much working on the farm. The wages at that time was $1 a day when you were burning tobacco. Not $1 an hour now, $1 a day. Some people now don't believe that. But anyway, I got a job over White Lake in the summertime. I'm making $2 a day, and with room and board, so I could save that $2, and I saved enough money to get me started to go to state, and I thought I wanted to be an engineer, so I enrolled in mechanical engineering freshman year. Before that year was over, I knew I didn't want to be an engineer. And I saw all the math you had to get into.
Some experience
I found out about this, they were starting this wildlife management, conservation and management program. And so I said, well, I grew up down there in Bladen County, hunting and fishing. We just about had to hunt and fish to make a living back during the Depression. And so when I came back to state that next September, I was going to enroll into wildlife conservation. For when I came down with malaria, well, my brother had to take me home, and I had a real case of it. By the time I got over the malaria, the bird season opened, and I decided I'd just stay home and bird hunt, and rather than going back to school in the middle of the year. So that's what I did. I stayed out that year, and so I went back the next year. Of course, enrolled in. So otherwise I would have been in the first class of wildlife conservation and management, but it turned out I was in the second class. And I remember, Tom, there were 25 of us enrolled in that class that fall, and there were 3 of us that graduated in it. It was a tough course. Ross Stevens, he put it to you. And so I graduated in 1941, and I took ROTC, and of course I had to pull a year of active duty then. And of course, y'all know what happened on this date in 1941, and that 1 year of active duty turned out to be 4.5. And I spent most of my time during the military in Newfoundland. We were assigned up there as a unit to provide security for the naval base at Argentia, Newfoundland. And so I stayed there most of my Army career. And when I got out in the fall of 45, and of course with my education and background, I naturally wanted to work in the wildlife field. So I went down what was then the Wildlife Division in the old Department of Conservation Development. And they offered me a job at $100 a month. And I didn't feel like I could exactly live on that. So I looked around and came across this position with what was then called the Predatory Rotocontrol in the federal agency. So I got on to that position as an assistant district agent, and worked for about a year and a half, and that job fell through when the government cut backs. So I went back. Well, this was in the summer of 47, and at that time, fortunately, the Wildlife Resource Commission, the legislature had passed the legislation, and it came into being on July the 1st, 1947. So I went back there, and they offered me $150 a month. So I took it as a biologist with the newly organized Wildlife Resource Commission. And at that time, there were not very many professional people in the Wildlife Commission. I'm not sure that I was the first full-time trained biologist or not, but I know that Ross Stevens was working part-time with the commission and part-time at State College. Now, most of the people in the Wildlife Commission at that time were just people who were hired because of who they were, who they knew, or something like that. And, so it was not exactly a professional organization that you would expect to find or hope to find. And what do I do from here now?
Well, what your job was and the various things
my
that
first-
the commission was doing at that time.
My
yeah.
first job then, we did made an inventory of the
Right.
wildlife resources in North Carolina. We took it county by county. We made a cover map of the county, and we interviewed people anywhere we could get information as to what the status of the various wildlife species was, and that was all put together in a book to give us a sort of a starting place, you know, as to where we could go from there. And then later, they set up where we had a biologist in each one of the 9 districts. The commission was divided into 9 districts, and they had a biologist in each district, just like you were a biologist in one district, and I was in this district here.
One question, in that interview process, or your cataloging process, did you work with other agencies doing that? Or just hunters and fishermen, or how did you get your information?
Anybody that we could find, particularly a lot of the old game wardens, as they called them back then. You see, they were not professional people, but they were pretty familiar with their territory, where they worked. They obviously knew what kind of wildlife was there, and pretty much what the situation was. And, so they were very valuable in compiling this information.
Now that program then evolved into what we later called the Upland Game Restoration Program.
Right.
And at what point then did Clyde Patton wasn't here when you went to work?
No.
When did he come in, and what happened then?
Yeah, he Clyde Patton came down here to interview for the job as the head of the education section, and he wound up being hired as the director. And of course, Patton was a very professional man, and he began to build a real professional organization. He gradually eased out some of those that were just hanging around, and pretty well filled all the positions with professional people. And so the organization really began to grow at that time. I don't know what you want to talk about, but I might go back and talk about before the Wildlife Commission came into being,
That's important.
and a man that a lot of people may not realize was probably more responsible for the Wildlife Commission coming into existence than anybody I know was Ross Stevens,
Right.
who was the professor of wildlife management at State while I was there. Ross Stevens was not a man that everybody liked. He had a very gruff way of doing things. People that didn't agree with him, he didn't like them. But anyway, he was a dedicated man to trying to improve the wildlife profession. And during World War II, Ross Stevens traveled all over North Carolina, county to county, organizing wildlife clubs to be affiliated with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. I don't know how he did it, but he just spent his entire time just about organizing wildlife clubs and getting enough sportsmen behind this thing that they could convince the legislature to create a real separate wildlife agency, as opposed to the way it was before, where it was just a division under the Department of Conservation Development. And I just think it was largely through his success that he got enough people interested and got them organized enough that they persuaded the legislature in 1947 to pass this bill creating the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission.
And that took 2 tries in the legislature,
Yeah,
didn't it?
that's right. I remember I went down there whenever their committees were meeting, they couldn't do it. But they finally got enough pressure they got some influential people like Tom White from Kinston and Turner Battle from Rocky Mount. They're big sportsmen and influential people. And they finally got enough pressure on the legislature to create the Wildlife Commission. And then we got Mr. Patton to come in and, like I say, as director, and he took the reins and really built up a professional organization.
Came up with the 5-point program that
Yeah.
we used to talk about.
Yeah.
So what then were your duties beyond that when you began putting the program together based on your inventory?
Well, that's when based on the inventory, we could determine some of the things that needed to be
Right.
done. And so by putting a trained biologist in each county, each district, we would work with the soil conservation people and the county agents, the various agencies that were already in existence and had people out there. And our primary mission, of course, was to work with farmers and individual landowners and showing them what they could do to improve the conditions for wildlife on their property. And of course, we then began to get into the planting program, the seed and plant distribution program. We'd not only give them advice, but we'd give them some seed or plants to plant to produce food and cover for the wildlife.
I know when I came to work in 1950, that was one of the major activities.
Yeah.
In fact, I think the first time I met you was on a trip to the Sandhills where we visited the nursery that
Yeah.
was producing this stuff.
Yeah, they had the nursery down there, and they have these truckloads of seed and plants going out all over the state. And Mr. Patton loved that seed program. I remember one time when Ted Mitchell, who was our project leader, we had talked about, maybe, de-emphasizing this seed, this planting program a little bit, and maybe, go into other areas where we thought maybe we could accomplish more. And so Ted Mitchell, he was good at writing letters, memos, so he wrote a memo to Mr. Patton suggesting, for one thing, that we discontinue the bicolor Lespedeza plant program. We produce seedlings, actual seedlings, put them in these huge bags and haul them out, and it was very expensive, and we felt like it was not really that productive, and he suggested that maybe we cut back on that some, and so when Mr. Patton sent his reply back, he praised us for our interest in our work and ideas of improving the program and everything. And on the margin of the memo, he wrote, "Keep them trucks rolling."
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it was a great, you know, for public relations, it was great, you know, and the hunters and fishermen, they loved it, you know. Yeah, this truck pulls up, you know, in the parking lot somewhere in the shopping center, and all people coming and loading all these bags of seed and plants, you know, and Patton was smart. He knew that that the people liked it.
Oh, yeah. Well, the bags we put the stuff in had the nice commission seal on it and everything, you know. It was good publicity, no doubt about that.
But I think back, somebody mentioned Wayne Bailey, who was our turkey biologist. He was a pretty smart man. And one time, every summer, all the biologists would take a field trip. We'd go out and around, mostly what we did was go around and look at places we developed, you know, where we planted, made wildlife plantings and different things. And we was out there one time, and Wayne Bailey asked me, said, "Well, I can see how these plantings, you know, provide food for wildlife. But says, explain to me how this is going to increase the quail population." Well, I didn't have any explanation how it was going to increase the quail population, because actually it didn't, of course. But it did improve your success of hunting. Now, I know that from experience because I was a quail hunter. And right around Holly Springs here, I put in a number of plantings of the wildlife materials like we use. And I know from experience that quite often you would find a covey of quail around those plantings. So it did increase the hunting success in a way, but it actually did not increase the quail population. I don't know whether you understand what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Which is what we really needs to be done. You know, just making the hunting success a little better for those who put in plantings is fine, but that's not getting to the root of the problem, where you need to overall increase the overall population.
Yeah, from my observations, the places where it may have done that was where you could do it on a large scale.
Yeah.
And we weren't able to get that done on private land.
Well, since I'm just rambling and talking, I'll go back even further. During the Great Depression, as we called it, back when I first started quail hunting in the 30s, There were just hundreds of farmers who went bankrupt during that Great Depression. And a lot of the land began to just grow up in native vegetation, ragweed, annual lespedeza, pottage pea, broom sedge, or whatever. And that was a quail paradise. Nobody was planting anything for the quail. Nobody, in fact, some of them weren't planting anything at all on some of this land. It just grew up in native vegetation, and there were just quail everywhere. And back then, everybody quail hunted. Even when I moved to Holly Springs in 1945, I knew of at least 10 people here who quail hunted right around this area. And yet you could go out anytime you wanted to and find plenty of birds. It was, in other words, the point I'm making, the hunting pressure didn't keep the quail down.
That's right.
They had the suitable conditions, and they survive and thrive. And I remember back then when you were hunting, for instance, if you were like going through the woods and you come across a small field, a place that had been cleared for cultivation. Back then, the farmers didn't farm all of these little fields. They had to cultivate a field at least every third year so it would qualify as agricultural land. Well, that means at least 2 years out of 3, it was laying out and just growing up in native vegetation. Ragweed up high as your head, and pottage pea and all that stuff. And the quail, they just had a home there. In the wintertime, they had all the seeds they wanted. In the spring and summer, it was full of insects, which were necessary for the development of the young birds. And they just literally lived in places like that. It reminds me of this couple that lived way back up in the hills during colonial days in a one-room shack. And one night the oldest son went out tomcatting, and he came back with a wife. And they climbed up the ladder in the loft that night, and where they slept. And the next morning his son poked his head down and says, "Paul," says, "tell Junior he can have my dog and he can have my gun." His dad said, "Son, what in the matter? You gone crazy?" He said, "No, I don't need them anymore." I said, "I got everything I ever gonna need right up here." Well, that's the way these areas were for the quail. They had everything they needed.
That's true.
Which is the reason I think that the commission is on the right track now of promoting native vegetation.
I agree.
Putting out individual plantings is fine. Like I say, it does help you sometimes to find the covey of birds, but to really improve the overall environment for quail or rabbits or whatever, I think that native vegetation is the answer.
I agree. I think you're right.
And, it took us a long time to get around to it, but I think they're on the right track now.
But don't you think the big difference between back then and today, though, is the land use changes?
Oh yeah.
That's the.
Oh yeah. There's one thing I got lost my track there. I was talking about these small fields that were such a ideal place and haven quail and rabbits and whatever. I've always said that one of the worst things that ever happened to quail hunting was the soybean. Now we, even when I was young back on the farm, we grew some soybeans that had a little black soybean that was mostly just grown for hay.